This is the Man in Black, here to introduce this weekly half hour of suspense. Tonight from Hollywood, we bring you, in response to requests from many thousands of listeners, Miss Agnes Moorehead, in one of the most famous suspense plays this series has ever presented, Sorry, Wrong Number. But before we raise the curtain on suspense, here is a message from your host, the Roma Wine Company of Fresno, California.
Your call, please.
Operator, I've been dialing Murray Hill 40098 now for the last 3/4 of an hour, and the line is always busy. I don't see how it could be busy that long. Will you try it for me, please?
I will be glad to try that number for you. One moment, please.
I don't see how it could be busy all this time. It's my husband's office. He's working late tonight, and I'm all alone here in the house. My health is very poor, and I've been feeling so nervous all day.
Ringing Murray Hill 40098.
Hello, and welcome to the Hyperfixation, where my friends come onto our show to tell us about things that excite them for 30-45 minutes so I can acquire an approximate knowledge of many things. My name is Roma. I use the they and them pronouns, and today I'm joined by Wheels.
Hey, I'm Wheels. I use they or she pronouns.
Hell yeah. So today, not today, but earlier in the month, a while ago, I have been awake for too long. You have reached out to me to talk about Golden Age radio. Is that correct?
Yep, you got it right. You can either call it Golden Age radio, or it's also often called old time radio, which it just communicates the vibe very well. I feel like calling it old time radio, or often abbreviated OTR. But talking about the era pre-television in which the radio was the primary place that many countries were going to for both to listen to music, but also for like serialized entertainment of all kinds. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Absolutely. I have very limited experience with Golden Age radio. I've always been excited to hear more of it. I mean, it's been featured in a lot of like video games or movies, or even like what was it? It's not Home Alone. It's the one with the lamp that's the sexy leg lamp.
Oh, A Christmas Story?
Yeah, in the Christmas Story, they would like all get around the radio and like listen to whatever's happening. Am I getting my movies mixed up?
Yeah, I forgot about that scene.
So just stuff like that, or even Drunk History. There was an episode where they talked about how it was Superman versus the KKK, and there was an audio drama that was basically Superman against the cult of the Flaming Red Dragon or something like that.
Yeah, the Superman show was pretty wild.
So I've been fascinated by it, but I've never like dipped my toe into that world officially. So this is me dipping my toe in. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course. I'm really happy to be here.
So when did this hyperfixation begin for you? Has it been your entire life, or has it been as of late?
No, it's recent. So I'm by no means an expert. But it was, I had, as you were mentioning, it kind of comes up everywhere. Part of the reason is that like there wasn't the structure in place to copyright these broadcasts when they were broadcasted. So even though they're not like so old, they would be in public domain if they were written works. There just wasn't the legal framework to even copyright them when they were copyright broadcasts when they were broadcasted. Mm-hmm. So they're not like, you wouldn't technically call them public domain, but they are uncopyrighted, so you can just use them in anything. So they kind of crop up here and there all over the place. So I had encountered it like incidentally that way. There are a lot of like local radio stations that will broadcast it or have like a few hours of the week where they will, because good way to fill time, because it's free content, it's free real estate.
It's free real estate.
But yeah, so I had been aware of it, and I had heard a few episodes of a few shows here or there that I was really impressed by, especially as someone who works in audio fiction.
Mhm.
But during the pandemic, I decided that I wanted to get more into it, mostly for that reason. Like, if I'm going to be making audio fiction on a weekly basis, I should probably dip my toe into the medium's golden age. And so I started listening to it over the pandemic, and the way I would recommend this to listeners as well. One very helpful tool for getting me into it was a podcast called the Mysterious Old Radio Listening Society, where there's just a bunch of guys who they will put a quick historical spiel at the top to explain what you're about to listen to. Then they'll play an old radio broadcast, and then they'll have a discussion of it afterwards. It was a really good way for me to get like a survey of what was, and not that they covered everything, but it was a survey of some of the stuff that was out there, and also the historical context was helpful in making me learn enough to be able to, learn the search keywords to find the rest of the stuff I was looking for. So that's how I got into it. But also, I have an inability to fall asleep without listening to something. So
Same.
It has slotted into that role in my life, and it's a seemingly endless source of content to fall asleep to, because it's literally decades of countless shows. Although, sadly, a lot of the episodes don't exist anymore because they weren't preserved. But for a lot of shows, we have almost their entire runs. And for others, we have, enough to listen to. So there's so much out there to listen to. So it's been consuming a lot of my listening.
Hell yeah. That speaks to me, honestly, as I my bedtime need to listen to has been Drawfee, and I'm running out.
Oh yeah.
I'm running out of content, and it's stressing me out. So this might be my new bedtime listening.
Yeah, I would recommend it. It can be hard to recommend people where, like, exactly what show to start with, because the genre menu essentially was very different in the late, there were radio broadcasts of this variety as early as like 1920, but in terms of like broadcasts that we still have recordings of, the earliest stuff is in the 30s. So when you're talking about like the 30s through the 50s, that kind of window that we're talking about, it's just like way different genres. Like, instead of our current like superhero obsession, for instance, like there's a ton of westerns and a ton of detective mysteries and a lot of soap operas. And so, yeah, it's just a different array of genres than you might be used to. So it's hard. It can be hard to pick one to start out with. So I just figured I would talk about a few shows that I like. In that detective category, there's a show called Candy Matson Yukon 28209, which is a great title because it has the end of it is like kind of bewildering sounding, but it would make sense to a listener in the era, because the Yukon 28209 bit is that's the format of old telephone numbers in America. It would be like Citadel 4516 or whatever. Like there's I don't know how it worked, but there were like words involved in your phone number. Seems complicated to me.
Oh, like when you had to go to like an operator, like you're like, operator, take me here, and the operator be like,
bring me Boston 25. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But so anyway, the premise of the show is that her phone number is Yukon 28209, so that's why it's called Candy Matson 28209. But anyway, it's a private detective show. Out of San Francisco, I believe, and it's also where it's set. And it was by a husband and wife duo, and
hell yeah.
the guy was like working on creating it, and someone suggested to him like the character is boring, or like, why are the detectives always men? And then he was like, oh, that's a great point. And so then he just cast his wife in the lead role because she's an actor.
It works.
So that's how, let me pull up the name. It's Monty Masters, and I'm blanking on her name. So let me look up him. Natalie Parks is his wife. So the two of them created the show together. And because of the era, it's kind of a gimmick in and of itself, like a woman detective.
Oh my.
So like, to a degree, that's like, it is supposed to be novel to the listener that she is a woman who is solving crimes. But it's really lovingly written, and it's a detective comedy specifically. So there are a lot of really serious detective shows and a lot of really goofy detective shows in that era. But this was specifically one that's kind of lampooning the genre a little bit, more interested in witty dialogue and jokes and likable characters than in like a real, we're gonna trick you mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really fun listen. That might be Candy Matson might just be a general recommend to listeners, as hard as it is to pick something like that. It's just very delightful. There's also I would say canonical, but that might be going a little too far. There's a gay character in it.
Oh hell yeah.
Her best friend it's like they wouldn't call him that for a variety of reasons, because we're talking like pre-Stonewall here, so the language is really different. But you can just tell by the character and the performance that it's a gay character. So it's neat to see that, and also it's just really funny and pleasant. So that's a good place to start. It sounded like you were gonna ask a question.
Oh, I'm just thinking about the queer-coded characters of history. That would be a fun YouTube channel to go through. Of like, yep,
yeah,
this one, this one right here. Very likely. Unconfirmed, uncanon, but likely.
That's a really good idea. Someone should do that.
Someone should do that. Give me credit, but
yeah, TM. Or you know what? Not TM. I love the fact that all of this stuff is freely available by that legal work, because it makes it very easy to get into. You can find basically all of these shows on like archive.org, or there's a website, OTRR.org. It's the OTR Researchers is the name of that organization. So there's a lot of places where you can just find all of these shows for free. Just download them. There's even a website that I use, forble.co.uk, FOURBLE.co.uk, that'll let you turn those archive.org feeds into podcast feeds. So a lot of easy ways to get into it. Anyway, that's a tangent off from, just to conclude on Candy Matson. There's a cautionary tale there, because it's an example of a show where lack of infrastructure to preserve that media, or even the intention, really, like the thought was like, okay, we broadcast these, people are going to listen to them once, and it's like, you don't think of all like stage productions of like, oh, these need to be captured, and that's not how they were thinking of them. So of the hundreds of episodes that were produced, I think it's like between 100 and 200 episodes that were produced.
Wow.
Only 14 remain. They're all bangers, so it's a real it's a real shame the rest of the show doesn't exist, but it makes it's really good what we still have. So that's Candy Matson.
I mentioned this before we started recording, but now that I'm putting some more puzzle pieces together in my head. So I was at my mom's house before recording, and I was talking to her partner, and Sean was telling me that he used to be super big into radio. He still has all the equipment. He's part of like a community that, like, if someone needs you to show up and like set them up for a radio or podcast recording, he will show up and set you up and then break down and leave. Like he's got a lot of cool stuff. But he also has just piles and piles of tape recordings from when like local college radio stations would broadcast these old time radio shows, and he would stick his tape recorder excuse me, up to the speaker basically and like save it for later. In the 80s he would go to these conventions to meet some of these people who made these radio shows. And because I just told him like, hey, I gotta leave by a certain time because I gotta go to this, we're gonna talk about Golden Age radio. And he like snapped his neck. He's like, what? I'm so into this. And so I'm thinking about it because he told me he has a whole case, like a whole box, unlabeled box of all these recordings, and was telling me about how on eBay people would sell these recordings on eBay. And I'm like, I wonder if we all put our noggins together and our box recordings together, would we get all of the episodes? Because like, who's can say like what golden missing episodes are out there?
There are still episodes being added to circulation all the time. So more episodes of Candy Matson, for example, could arise in the future. There is always that hope. So if anybody who knows anyone who has a collection of tapes like that, make sure they know what they have, because they might have an episode that only they have if they, happen to get it at like a particular convention or whatever. And that is a good segue into kind of the history bits that a lot of the recordings that we do have are the result of either, as you said, listeners, enthusiasts of radio, both at the time and later, who are swapping these recordings of their favorites. But also the World War II has a pretty huge impact on the history of radio, and a lot of military bases in many countries, but I mostly know the English language history, of course, because that's my native language. So like for instance, there was the Armed Forces Radio Service, I believe it was called, that in American military bases there would be they would have their own like shortwave radio broadcasts to the crew, both for informational purposes, of course, and instructional reasons, but also just for entertainment. And so a lot of these, and so the military would request these companies that produce the broadcast to send us one of the few master recordings you make or whatever, and then we will rebroadcast it for the troops. And that is one of the reasons that we still have copies of a lot of episodes. And so like there will be like random episodes where we don't have the whole thing because like the military like radio service commanding the person in charge of like censoring had to cut out all the ads, and also usually it's just like any like product placement that they have to cut out, and so often you'll get episodes where like the only extant versions have like some army guy at the beginning going like it from like 1942 being like, or 3 or whatever, being like, hey guys, you're about to listen to an episode of The Inner Sanctum, enjoy it. And then like the actual show will play. It's just a really neat peek into time, but also that military influence goes further because you've got a bunch of people learning how to use radio equipment in the war. And then they come back and either become, people working in the industry or just enthusiasts or ham radio enthusiasts. And so like that, the war kind of accelerates a lot of the interest and expertise in radio. But let's see, that I should probably mention a different show at this point. Another one that listeners should definitely check out is Suspense. This was one of the most, like, Candy Matson wasn't the previous show wasn't necessarily like one of the biggest shows in the world. It just happens to be like one of my favorite shows.
Yeah.
Suspense was one of the biggest shows of its time, and it was an anthology program of, as the title would suggest, suspense stories. Once you get past like 4 or 5 kind of rough start first. It's literally like recommending a podcast. It's like once you get past, like, they're kind of figuring themselves out in the first few episodes, but like after listen to like at least 3 and see if you like it. But no, like and because it's an anthology program, you don't have to start at the beginning. So but anyway, there's a huge catalog of these anthology suspense stories that would star huge names of the time, like Orson Welles, Agnes Moorehead, who, these names might not mean anything to modern
I've heard of them before, so that means something.
But big names of the era, and in really well written suspense stories. So that's Suspense. There was also a competitor program that was quite similar but kind of like lower budget and scrappier, called Escape, that had similar vibes that listeners might also like. There were a lot of anthology shows. Generally, there are also a lot of like I guess you like they are horror shows, but the vibe is so different when we're talking about horror from that many years ago.
Yeah, I was curious about that. Like, what is scary back in 1940s versus scary now? Because scary now is like some Black Mirror stuff, or like some really culty like supernatural horror stuff. But
you bet. And that's a good reminder for me about a caveat I should have said earlier. Because this stuff is as old as it is, so are the sensibilities. So sometimes the content is, in a modern context, a bummer. But that's just the fact of the matter. It's kind of hard to avoid when we're talking about media that's 70 plus years old.
Yeah.
That being said, a lot of these horror stories deal with like fear. They're like that kind of like morality tale. This is like the stuff that would like later inspire a Twilight Zone or like Tales from the Crypt. So these like morality tale stories of like the supernatural, like racist stereotypes about what a witch or a magic user looks like. There's, like I said, a lot of like outdated, either like racial horror, like being worried of the other, a lot of like, a lot of other axes of oppression kind of show up like that too. A lot of them are like just like women be crazy and that's scary. But anyway, beyond that, there are also a lot of in that period, there are a lot of fears about. Well, one really good episode of Suspense is like a home invasion story, which, I mean, I guess since these are all uncopyrighted, as I said, you could even like tack an episode on the end of this. And a good one to do would be Suspense's, and I can link it to you. Sorry, Wrong Number is a home invasion story where that's an Agnes Moorehead episode. She plays a bedridden woman who is home alone while her husband is out late at work, and it's like it plays on like the horror of being the mods accidentally pulled you into the wrong Discord channel because she's like trying to make a call, but the operator somehow gets her onto someone else's private call, and she overhears the planning of a break-in. And the more she listens, and they can't hear her, so all she can do is listen, and she hears just enough details that it begins to describe where she lives, and it spirals from there and gets very scary. That would be maybe a good episode to flop.
Honestly, that is pretty terrifying.
It's horrifying. Yeah. It's a really effective horror piece. So there's that. Another horror anthology show that's worth noting is Lights Out, which was created by this guy Arch Oboler, which is just a good name. Arch Obler was awesome. He was like, if I'm remembering my history correct, I think he was like a leftist and all of these things. A very interesting artist. He was one of the, along with another artist, Willis Cooper. Willis Cooper actually started that show. Actually, now that I'm remembering my history better, Willis Cooper started Lights Out, but after its first few years, he ended up handing it off to Arch Obler, and we have way more of the Arch Obler episodes just because we have way more of the later years of radio generally.
Yeah.
We have a lot more of the Arch Obler years, but both of them, because Willis Cooper would go on to create a show called Quiet Please, from which we do have surviving episodes. So both of them, between those two shows, as well as a lot of other people, especially if you want to talk about in radio of other languages. But in terms of English, they are some of the earliest that are doing that type of like first person narration horror that is like, I don't know, it's kind of like everything that you hear in like modern audio. There's a lot of like, horror fiction podcasts that trade exclusively, on that format. And that's kind of where it was figured out. And a lot of those stories there's some like science fiction adjacent fears. Cause like, this is before, like, in most of these cases, we're talking like before the nuclear bomb would kind of change what sci-fi horror meant. But there are still like kind of proto sci-fi. And I mean, they are sci-fi, but just different than what we would recognize as sci-fi. These kind of like sci-fi horror things about monsters, or a lot of fears about, I guess you would say, like fear of getting mental illness, or like fear of losing of losing control or connection to reality. Arch Obler's work on Lights Out in particular has a lot of protagonists whose narration, as the story goes on, gets more and more frenetic and stream of consciousness as they get into the scarier and less the world of horror that makes less and less sense. And their narration starts to get more and more frenetic. He was great at that type of horror narration story. All of them recognizing that like the audio medium is very conducive to horror because the listener is imagining the thing that scares them, as opposed to you showing it and the viewer being like, yeah, that CG is dog shit or whatever. The CG in your imagination. I mean, I guess everyone's different in terms of what they can imagine, but many people's imagination can conjure up some pretty terrifying imagery. So I find it very effective.
I am curious to see, and I'm sorry if I cut you off.
Nope.
So I in college, I took a handful of classes. I really hope this professor isn't listening to my podcast. That would be real wild if he was. But I had a huge crush on this professor. Nothing came of it. But I took a lot of his classes. Even my college guidance counselor was like, "Why are you doing this?" I'm like, "I'm just really into history." But so he had a handful of classes called what was it? The 20th century culture. What is it? 20th century cultural politics of music, and then I took the same thing but of film. And we got to watch a lot of like films. I think I can't remember which specifically comes to mind. Like we watched, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the one where they came from space and it was like plants turning into people and doing
Pod People or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Anyway,
probably Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Wait, Pod People is the B movie. I think Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or what's the other one I'm thinking? I guess I don't think Day the Earth Stood Still has.
I think we watched that one too, but
yeah. Anyway, yeah, I have a film theory degree, so I have fond memories of many such courses. Yeah, it's very fun to have, it was very fun to have class just show up and watch a movie, and then next class we'll talk about it.
Exactly, and like but I really love that we got to not just sit and watch movies. Like, he did passionately care about what we were talking about, and I'm sure same thing with your classes where we got to analyze it and like look at what was going on in the world at the same time and what was being represented. And so I'm kind of curious to see the timelines in tandem of what was going on with radio and with movies simultaneously. Like, what paces were they moving at? Like, I would find that to be super fascinating, especially with, now that we're talking about the horror genre of like, how did they both react? Did one get like scarier faster than the other, or was movies trying to keep up, or did movies pour people from? Well, no, because radio was around first. So did like radio pour people into watching? I'm just very curious about the whole the science and the statistics behind it, but I know it'd be very difficult to acquire that statistics.
Yeah, the interplay between all those mediums is really interesting, and that brings up a good point that I wouldn't have thought to mention otherwise. There were a good number of programs that were essentially the one that we have a lot of episodes for that's like mostly good is one called the Lux. I think it was called Lux Radio Theater of the Air, I think was the full title, but I'm sure if you just look up Lux Radio Theater, it'll come up, LUX. But it and other shows like it would involve making adaptations, radio adaptations, usually truncated, like short versions of movies that were playing at the time.
Ooh.
So it's like you would hear like the 45-minute plus 15 minutes of commercials version of X, Y, or Z movie. Sometimes in especially, I think they did it almost all the time with Lux Radio Theater, but sometimes with the original cast too. They would bring in the original cast to make these truncated audio drama versions to like entice you to then go see the movie, but also just to earn money from the sponsored radio program, as all of these were virtually all these programs had corporate sponsors.
Hey, that still continues today.
For sure. And I don't know, I find a lot of those commercials themselves interesting and funny. Like the very noteworthy show The Shadow, the kind of like proto superhero kind of anti-hero figure, although he's more in the later episodes, he's more just like a hero. Anyway, that show is sponsored by Blue Coal,
Hey.
which is exactly what it sounds like, and it's very funny to me. But anyway, yeah, even the old commercials are kind of entertaining for, as you were mentioning, just that historical interest. You'll hear a lot of like cigarette commercials, as unfortunately that industry is like at the beating heart of ads in general and like the beginning of the marketing industry as we know it. So a lot of these programs were sponsored by various cigarette companies, or I've heard ones, well, a lot of them from the war period are getting government funding to beg for war bonds, get you to buy war bonds. So a lot of interesting economics involved, definitely. And interesting interactions with the other mediums around, because then TV shows up and begins to take a lot of the audience from not that people just like immediately stopped listening to radio and started watching television, but just over time it starts to occupy more of people's media habits and radio less. It begins to transform into like, the kind of like either music or talk radio landscape that, like I would remember growing up, for instance. But yeah, once TV shows up, that effect kind of starts to happen. But you still, even, late into the 50s and even beyond, you still have really fascinating radio programs that aren't, and not that music broadcasts aren't awesome too, but just in terms of my interest in radio drama, there's even some later stuff than that, some revival programs like in the 70s and things. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
You're
rambling.
allowed. I was following. I'm having a tangent in my own head as well of like, I wonder if we put if there was a chart where we could compare modern podcasting to different eras of radio And
so many parallels. Yeah,
we just never
I
let
think
it
about
go.
that a lot. Making Very Random Encounters, my the improv fiction show that I make,
Mhm.
because a lot of these shows, some of these shows did have like bigger budgets, big casts, many crew, entire orchestras to play the music. But the vast majority of these shows were a lot scrappier,
Mhm.
a lot lower budget, done by like regional teams or like, individual artists at some whatever station, and, the actors in that local area. And yeah, that just because of the nature of how radio works, and the way that it's dispersed and how it's going, you necessarily will need stations in all of these places. You end up having then radio production talent in all of these places, and so there are a lot of like small regional shows that to me like feel a lot like what I'm doing
Mhm.
in the modern day, making a show like that, of like a small group of collaborators making something, just like not necessarily worrying about putting out the most polished thing week in and week out, but just like try and entertain the audience, man. Give them what, like, have a little fun, make something cool, be a little creative with it, entertain people every week. I there's a lot that I find in common with those folks making radio shows back then, for
Oh,
sure.
me too. Oh my goodness. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if there was a Bim Bam bit where they were like, there was a Yahoo Answers, and it's like, what if there was like a horn, and you blew the horn, and like heroes from America's past would just come back for like 24 hours? Do you think they could help us fix the world's problems? And it's like, well, no, they'd probably have a heart attack and die of like the common cold instantly. But
Yeah.
it's like, but what if we brought like just a handful of like radio people from the 40s just back? I know that some of them are still alive, but not all of them. Well, 40s,
Orson Welles is my
60,
answer
80.
to that general question of like, who is the person from history you would want to have lunch with?
Yeah. I just
Orson Welles, who is obviously known, famous for many things, like the director of what many consider the best movie, but also he was a radio, he was pioneer is bad language. What should I say? He was a real
trailblazer. Ah,
trailblazer, I guess. He was an avant-garde artist in radio, doing a lot of really cool things in that era, and he would be my answer to who would you want lunch with, both because I love his movies,
Mhm.
and I like The Shadow, which he was the first actor to play The Shadow. I like like, you'll have probably heard of his War of the Worlds broadcast,
okay, that rings a bell.
which like you've probably heard, like, oh, people heard it and they thought it was real, and that they caused riots and people died, and there were buildings burned. All of that is an exaggeration.
Bruh.
There might have been people who were convinced it was real, but more likely those reports are like
Wait.
essentially like Orson Welles and company trying to generate buzz for the kind of
Oh no, I feel like it did scare
realistic.
the shit out of people. I don't mean to interrupt you. No, I'm having a brain blast. I'm my 19-year-old me is shooting a laser beam at me now, 27. Like, remember this, bitch? No, people didn't. I'm pretty sure it was the War of the Worlds podcast.
Yeah.
The War of the Worlds radio
Broadcast, yeah.
where people were listening to it and actually like calling the police. Like, it scared the shit out of them.
Yeah, they're
Oh my god.
like I was saying, that story is kind of an exaggeration. There might have been like a few calls like that you're describing,
True.
but a lot of that story is like, if you think about it, that story is very beneficial to Orson Welles and company, who are trying to get people to tune into their radio show every week. So of course they're going to go around telling people, yeah, there was like rioting in the streets and people were calling in thinking, aliens were really coming, although, maybe there were like a few calls or whatever.
Yeah. No, that tracks.
The same way that like a company today would be like, we were inundated with entries to our Snickers, which do you want, left or right? Well, fine, whatever. I'm sure you were inundated. Anyway, it's like, I don't know. I respect Orson Welles for the grind. He was ahead of his time.
Oh my god.
But anyway, not only is it historically significant because you'll just hear that broadcast mentioned and referenced a lot in media, but also it's just like a good listen. It's really well produced. It adapts War of the Worlds in a really clever way where a portion of it does play as there's kind of like a second half that is a more traditional, like there's a protagonist and that part's great too. There's like a protagonist solves problem, gets to ending kind of typical story. But the first half of it does play as if it's a news broadcast telling you, yep, the aliens are here, they're taking over.
Alien.
And that choice to adapt the story in that way is really, really clever. It's super effective. It's a good use of the medium. So that's also a recommended listen for folks. The Shadow, as I mentioned, also Orson Welles at the beginning, but other actors over time. Really fun. The premise is a guy who can use like mind control techniques to make himself invisible to criminals, to anyone, but then he uses it to fight crime. Very fun, kind of hokey, as a lot of this is. The old Superman show, what was it called? The Adventures of Superman. Very, very, very hokey. I mean, it's like for children, of course, but it's very interesting if you're a fan of superheroes, as I am, because this is concurrent with the earliest Superman comics. So like Jimmy Olsen's first appearance in any medium is in the radio show, not the comic.
Wait, who's Jimmy Olsen? I'm not super familiar with
Yeah, he's like Superman's like best, like in the earliest stories, he was like the copy boy at the Daily the Daily Planet. Is that, I always get the fake.
Yeah, I feel you. I don't know.
I always get the fake journalistic institutions mixed up if it's the Bugle or the Planet to fucking whatever. I think it is the Daily Planet the Superman works at. Clark Kent, unrelated to Superman, works at. But in the oldest stories, Jimmy Olsen is like the copy boy assistant at working for the Planet. But then he grows up and is a young adult in the newer stories. But he's like Superman's best friend, who's always like kind of the audience surrogate in a lot of those early stories. As Superman would get down to shenanigans, Jimmy Olsen, or it would be Jimmy Olsen or Lois Lane would be in trouble, and Superman would have to save them or whatever. But anyway, there was a character that the artist in the comic drew that was like a boy who was like an assistant in the paper's office that would appear in background shots, but was never named, never had any lines. When the people started making the radio show, it's kind of convention in kids shows and a lot of kids shows of that era where there would be a kid character or at least like a quite young adult character that would be like the character that the kid would identify with. Like the Lone Ranger had some like in a anyway,
yeah.
A lot of shows would have that, like a little kid that would be the ride along character. And that was, and so they made Jimmy Olsen to fit that role in the radio show. And then the comic creators, whose names I don't remember, hearing what the radio people were doing, were like, oh, that's a cool character. And so then they made that background character that they had been drawing. They retconned him into being Jimmy Olsen from the radio show. So then the character exists in both.
Nice.
So arguably his first appearance is in the comics, but the character with a name Jimmy Olsen wasn't created until the radio show. And then they retcon him in as that background character, and then he appears a lot more in the comics. But anyway, that Superman radio show is really goofy. It's really strange to hear episodes where Superman will just like, this isn't like the modern Superman with like moral compunctions about like breaking criminals' bones.
What?
He will just like throw someone against a wall and shit.
Bruh.
But mostly he's a nice guy, but like there's some moments where it's like, whoa, like
Yo,
if they're the
Superman.
bad guy, there's kind of like no holds barred. He doesn't kill anyone, but
Oh, good.
anyway, all of that, and most of the stories are like, by the standards of like modern superhero stories, like people would be like, boo, there's too much talking, more superpower stuff. Why isn't he fighting anything?
Laser
Because a lot of it
eyes.
is just like him hanging out with Lois Lane or Jimmy Olsen or Perry White or weird characters that I don't even think exist in the comics. Like there's this character that he spends a few of the Superman serials with called Tumbleweed Jones.
Now that's a
And just, like,
non-binary name if I've ever heard it.
He's just like a generic cowboy old man, kind of, I don't know much about all this fancy city slick and stuff, but I do love my good friend Clark Kent and that unrelated flying man Superman. Anyway, very strange show, but also a very fun peek into early superhero history, if that's something you're into. Have I been going too long?
No, not at all. You could keep talking forever
Okay.
if I had any choice in the matter.
So much I should mention. Like, this is like where game shows get their start, and thus kind of in turn, where this is like the way before reality shows, but is kind of the origin point for game shows and reality shows and all of that. All of that happens on the radio. A lot of like contest shows is kind of where it begins. I was listening. There's a really cool feed that archive.org has called the Singles and Doubles Collection, which is shows where we only have 1 or 2 episodes extant. I use that as as like sleeping fodder a lot.
Mhm.
You kind of got to watch out because sometimes that's there's kind of a Schrodinger's racism thing that happens when you start it. You're like, I really hope this isn't a minstrel show that I'm turning on, when it's just a feed
Ooh.
of random shows from that era, which unfortunately there were a lot of
Yep.
those. But anyway, there are a lot of unproblematic fun oddities in that collection, and one of them that I was listening to that's like me, that was like a good example of like a game show, but also like it was a hybrid with audio drama stuff. It was, and again, we only have like 1 or 2 episodes of it, but it was called Road to Hollywood, and like aspiring actors would like, compete for a shot to be in the movies, and it just echoed so much of like, yeah, that could be any game show like today.
Bruh.
Thought that was neat.
I'm wondering, because I'm like looking at it, I'm like, so we've got all these. I'm looking at podcasts and like content of today, and I'm like, is there like a beauty vloggers version of a radio show? Is there? I mean, I'm sure there was sports and
Yeah, for sure. There were broadcasts on tons of subject matter. I don't know all the particulars, but there were educational broadcasts and like public service announcement broadcasts, and as you're saying, like hobbyist broadcasts about certain subject matters, tons and tons of stuff, because not that it was the only game in town. Like you could go to a movie and see like a newsreel beforehand, but the convenience of being able to have it in your home, it kind of had a monopoly on that idea, outside of like records or books, I suppose.
Yeah.
For like serialized entertainment. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought again.
My
there.
bad.
Other cool stuff. What else should I mention? There's just so many genres. As I mentioned, the soap operas were pretty popular. One I've heard of but never listened to is One Man's Family. I know was one of those shows that like aired for an unbelievable number of years and episodes.
Is it just Family Guy? Please tell me it's just Family Guy.
I mean, probably. I haven't listened to it, but there are a lot of like soap operas that were, analogous to yeah, either like sitcoms or just like soap operas. There's tons of stuff. Oh, I should just mention like I kind of talked about this before with like archive.org or that forbull.co.uk are good starting points. But you can also just search, like open up a podcast app and just search old radio. Because of their uncopyrighted status, there are a ton of people who repackage them into podcast feeds. A lot of them are really nice. There's a guy, Adam Graham, who makes a lot of them that have really nice historical information at the top and bottom, the beginning of and the end of the broadcasts. There's another guy. There's Andrew Rhines, I think, is the name of the other guy. There's a bunch of, in other words, there's a bunch of middle-aged white Midwestern boomers who have kindly repackaged this material for you into podcast feeds that you can find either just by searching like old radio and whatever genre, or just like old radio and the name of the show. You'll probably find a podcast feed of it somewhere.
Oh man, part of me wants to like, if you're looking for something in particular, part of me wants to be like, hey Sean, you got any pitches?
Yeah, no, for sure. Ask people like what their favorites are. Like if you know anybody, and this is to listeners too, like I'm sure anybody who's into this would be happy to tell you like their favorite, because it's like not a hobby you really get to talk to that many people about outside of like hobbyist spaces.
Yeah.
So like the idea of a person in real life wanted to ask me what my favorite radio broadcast. I think most of us would be happy to tell you what our favorites are. My favorites are probably Candy Matson, Quiet Please. What else I really like Suspense. Some other of my particular favorites. There are quite a few detective shows that I really like. There's sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the show. Casey Crime Photographer is a fun one. It's a very like lighthearted detective show about a guy who he's a photographer for the paper who always just winds up either accidentally falling into being the photographer at the scene of a crime, or is like assigned to it by the paper and then ends up solving the crime for the police. That's a fun one.
Oh man.
Yeah, I could just sit here listing shows forever, but you probably I've probably listed enough recommendations. And yeah, if listeners end up checking stuff out, let me know, or if they want recommendations, you can let me know either in the Hyperfix Discord in the appropriate channel, or just message me on Twitter or whatever. I'd be happy to recommend stuff.
Please do, because now my bedtime routine is about to get a new glow up.
The Shadow is prime bedtime material.
Now, how scary is it?
Usually not exceptionally scary. I mean, it's like only as scary as you are paying attention. Like you can't really be that scared to a narrator telling you something scary unless you're paying attention to it. You know what I mean?
I get the super spook 'em ups real easy.
Well, you should actually prime. I am kind of fucked up. I listen to a lot of horror stuff to fall asleep, so I'm the wrong person to ask about how scary something is. I don't find suspense or that sort of thing all that scary, but or The Shadow. The Shadow is not scary at all. You could listen to The Shadow. That's good sleeping material. Superman it's literally a kid's show. Great sleeping material. Very funny and like weird. I Love a Mystery is a good like kind of young adult oriented serialized mystery show.
Hell yeah. Okay. So I'll
many places to go.
This is also giving me some like a little bit of the episode hasn't released as of recording. It releases in Jesus. What are you doing? Get off my desk. Ugh. Jesus, first interruption of the season. Me and Lewis sat with our guest Demon, and we talked about the Magnus archives, and I feel like that definitely has some.
I listened to all of that show.
Is it like it's definitely not as scary as the Magnus Archives, because that freaks me out a little bit, but in a good way. Like, it's entertaining and I enjoy it, but I definitely cannot listen to it at night.
I don't think there are any. I mean, it depends what show. There are episodes of Quiet Please that are scary as fuck. but some other shows, no. Like there's a quote unquote horror show called Inner Sanctum that's a lot of fun. That's like more like, it's that kind of like Tales from the Crypt style, like, there's even a horror host kind of guy who's like, ooh, isn't that ghoulish? He like always uses like, very like ghoulish puns and things in between the story. But there's kind of like every kind of horror, because like it's not just a we're talking about tons and tons of shows, so it runs the gamut of how scary. Some real scary episodes of Quiet Please though that I really love. If you just want something to fall asleep to, I think The Shadow is probably the best recommendation. It's easy, right in the strike zone. I do want to point out, I just realized this now as I was looking something up. One of the sponsors for Suspense, for like that show Suspense, it's one of its longest running sponsors for like one of the best eras of the show was Roma Wines.
It's me.
So it's you. I don't know. I just feel like
as something to also tack on to the bit of with my name in Italian advertisements. My friends are currently, I don't know if they took this photo in Japan, whether they went to Japan and returned and took the photo, or it was in Japan. But there's a place called Tony Roma's, and my partner's name is Tony. So it's just like, that's our place.
Oh,
we
wow.
own it.
Yeah, that's that's true.
Yeah, so it's like, I'm on the bottom of all your pizza boxes. Tony's making all your pizzas. Just think about us in the hyperfixation next time you eat that hot slice of pie. Or drink your Roma wine.
That's
I don't know if
awesome.
they're still around.
I don't either.
But if they are, I don't even drink all that much, but I'll take a token bottle of Roma wine. That's fine. They should give it to me at a discount. But I did have another question. So we've been talking a lot about podcasts that are really great for sleeping too. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily listen to podcasts when they go to sleep. I'm sure there's a lot of people who do, but I know a lot of people listen to podcasts while they work or while they're doing an activity. So would you say these are also good for doing an activity or working podcasts, or do you have other recommendations for like something you're more listening to?
Oh, I absolutely use this for that as well. I will probably pick the slightly headier stuff if I'm like actually awake, because like the kid, we're talking about like media that was oriented towards like young adults 70 years ago. It's gonna be pretty like Dame and kind of like middle of the road, not very, certainly not provocative, but some of the more sophisticated stuff is really, really fascinating still as a modern listener. There is an experimental show called, it's got such a generic name, so I'm afraid I'm going to get it wrong. It's called the CBS Radio Workshop. They've got a really fantastic adaptation of Brave New World in like 2 parts. That's a super great if you're just working and want an audio drama to listen to. I would that's a great one I could recommend. It's just got really great Foley, both on that episode, but also on that program generally. That's a good recommendation for something that's like, engaging enough that it's not going to put you to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
I'm recommending Suspense for everything, but Suspense also has a lot of great episodes. Quiet Please, I would also put into this category of like, it's better when you can pay attention. Quiet Please, again, is one of those anthology horror shows. What's great about it, it's the every episode stars the same guy, Ernest Chappell, and he was originally a radio announcer, but then the creator of the show, Willis Cooper, worked with him in something or another and just recognized his voice was not just perfect as a radio announcer, but had this kind of like everyman quality. And it really does. And so he brings this like this warmth and this very personal quality to like all of the main characters that he plays in every episode. And a lot of them turn out to be, part of the horror themselves. Either, it turns out they're the person talking was like a killer, or they get possessed by the monster by the end of it or whatever. But he always kind of like lulls you into a false sense of security by his
I love that.
But just like really calm and like personable, and kind of like he plays a lot of like working class characters and gets like the kind of the dialect right in it. Great show, Quiet Please. What the episode that you'll hear recommended for it, I would also recommend. It's called Thing on the Forble Board. That's where that website forble.co.uk gets its name from. Thing on the Forble Board is a horror. It's basically like a we dug too far horror genre of horror story about an oil derrick, and they dug too far into the earth and uncovered something unholy. So if that's like your kind of horror, Thing on the Forble Board is it's that kind of horror that is not necessarily like terrifying in the moment. I mean, it is scary in the moment, but it's just like the idea and the kind of the picture sticks with you for a long time because it's really I don't want to give too much away. The ending of that is incredible. Thing on the Formal Board's great. On the so this will be a bummer. I'll probably do more of these. So as of when we're recording this, I'm going to do a stream tomorrow, so you already missed that one, listener. But I'll probably be doing more of these streams where I'm just playing a game and putting OTR in the background because, as I've reiterated, you can do that freely. One of the shows that I'm going to play in tomorrow's stream is another Quiet Please episode called Northern Lights. That is this really eerie sci-fi horror thing that story that really makes good use of the human voice as like something to scare you. The monster is voiced by a person, and there's a lot of scary sounds a person can make with their voice, it turns out. And that episode of Quiet Please Northern Lights is a good example.
Ooh. Oh, I'm excited for this because I'm prepared. My evening's been blocked off. I'm here for this stream. And I also love.
Yay! I'm glad. You should hop into the call too, and because like my idea for it is just like if I end up being just silent and letting it play, that's great. If I end up like commenting just by myself, that's great. But also if we can Mystery Science Theater it and get more voices, just commenting on however we react to it as it goes. That'd be perfect.
I don't have Minecraft, but I do play a shit ton of Rocket League. So I do also get very into Rocket League. So I could just imagine like some really intense moment happens and I'm like, God damn it. Just start yelling out of nowhere. We were, what was it? The Once Miss Wonders episode that was recorded recently. Me and Jakey were watching it. Is it Once Miss Wonders? I can't remember. But it was that musical. And we were watching the musical and I was playing Rocket League, but I wasn't like totally watching the movie at the moment. And very same thing. I would be like, oh shit. And it's like the guy did something really shitty and it just worked out really perfectly in tandem. So hopefully I can bring that same energy.
Yeah.
It would be fun. I am so prepared for tomorrow. I am so prepared for my new lifestyle of Golden Age radio listening.
Hell yeah. I love this shit. So I'd love more people to talk about it with. That goes to listeners too. So nerd out with me anytime.
Please do. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention about Golden Age radio? Or
I mean, there's a trillion things I should, but I would just be sitting here listing shows till the cows come home. And I think I listed enough recommendations. Probably too many.
Well, then you can just pull me in a call anytime and keep talking in my ear.
Okay. Will do.
So, what do I... Man, I feel... just before we get into like the outros and stuff, I just kind of want to like summarize and recap. Like, I love how there was what I thought I knew, and there's just, you can kind of just like, oh, I just kind of know this thing exists, and that's all there is to it. And like live in blissful ignorance. But now that the curtain has been drawn, and I can see all these beautiful qualities and like how the moving parts of media have been over the years, and working in tandem with other beautiful forms of media like music, acting, movies, radio, and it's just so fulfilling. You know what I mean? Of like, oh, like it's just my worldview has opened up a little bit more, and also being able to recognize media with like modern eyes of like, okay, like yes, it's problematic, but there's still a lot of good in there. Well, not all of it's problematic, but there's qualities to it due to its time.
Yeah, there's kind of like it's as long as sometimes it's difficult to be able to have that kind of historical distance, but if you are able to stomach just the historicity of it all, and seeing, because it is a way to peer into history, radio, and you see many facets of history, and a lot of those are good and a lot of those are bad, but it's a good window into all of it.
And to be able to kind of see how times have changed, but also like there's good ways that history, usually when people say, oh, history repeats itself, it's usually a bad thing because of like but it's kind of,
but good things keep happening too. Yeah, that's absolutely a good point. And I don't think I ever thought of it.
Like we all sit on a train and read our newspapers, but now we're on a bus and we're looking at our smartphones. Like it's it's all very similar. We've been doing the same stuff, but it's different because technology and societal norms. So I think it's just kind of neat. Like so what I'm doing now, if I got to pick my ye old golden age radio guy, and was like, hey, by the way, we're still doing the same shit, but like, check this out. Look at Adobe Auditions. This shit's insane.
I mean, it's a lot of a lot of the stuff that we use now in terms of like software and equipment, like modern DAWs, digital audio workstations like Adobe Audition or Reaper or Pro Tools, et cetera, their origin is in production for radio. Primarily, but all mediums, but a lot for radio. So I'm sure your radio guy, if he hasn't seen Adobe Audition in particular, he's absolutely seen something like it.
And after his small heart attack, it'd be kind of neat to be like, but check out what we can do.
Yeah.
It goes on.
Well, I mean, I guess I would push back and say like they were doing this shit. They were doing fascinating shit back then too. I mean, it is kind of mind blowing, like the wealth of like sound effects libraries that you can get for free nowadays, and music libraries, and so we can very cheaply build very, very sweeping, grandiose and just because of the high fidelity of what we're able to broadcast with, like, there's not radio static and terrible, it's high quality. So there's a lot that we can do in that regard that we couldn't. But just in terms of like pushing the envelope storytelling using audio, like they were doing it back then too. It's there's always been cool shit.
And then like, I assume normally they would have to record within the same room or same vicinity. But it's like I can.
A lot of these broadcasts were live.
Yeah.
And so like performed live, and so you'll hear line flubs and things like that. So it feels a lot like attending a theatrical performance in that regard. A lot of other shows were pre-recorded, or you'll to use the parlance of the time, or like the language that you'll hear in those episodes, they'll say it's by transcription. That's how they would say it, as in like, this is pre-recorded. This isn't a live broadcast. It's, we had these actors, record earlier, and they would say that is a broadcast by transcription. But a lot of them were live with like live musical performers, live actors.
We need to step our game up.
commercials and announcers were done live. I mean, we do that shit too on Twitch. It's like all the same shit. Like you were saying.
But I don't have like a band.
History keeps repeating itself.
Moonshot needs a band.
That's true. That's true. We do, like there are a lot of us that I play the trumpet. There's a lot of us that play instruments. Like we could get into that.
Moonshot band, and then we do full ass Riley Hopkins and their amazing friends live broadcasts.
Yo.
I'm just saying, I'm an ideas guy sometimes, but this needs to happen.
You would need a lot of audio equipment, but between the lot of us, we probably already have it.
Oh, yep. Okay, it's a plan now. I've decided.
Cool. I think I'm
that's
done.
valid.
I think I've talked all my radio things.
You did all of the things. Thank you for coming and sharing with me your Golden Age radio knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the space to info dump.
Now, where can people find you on the internet to ask you for more recommendations?
Yeah, you can get at me at Singular Wheels on Twitter or TikTok or on a bunch of Discord servers for either the Hyperfix Discord server or Moonshot. I'm in both of those. I'm around. Singular Wheels. All those places. Also, you can listen to me on Very Random Encounters. That's my weekly tabletop actual play audio fiction podcast. It really is about the improv, the role playing, the audio fiction aspects first, and kind of the game aspects second. A lot of it is really informed by my listening of this era. We make a lot of fantastic fucking audio fiction every week in a variety of genres because we do shorter seasons in any genre using a ton of role-playing games. So folks should listen to Very Random Encounters if they like audio fiction. And then keep an eye out in the mid to long future for my show Total Depravity, where I talk about religious studies.
Hell yeah. Speaking of religious studies, if you want to hear more of Wheels' Hyperfixations, and maybe you're a fairly recent listener, go back to season 2, episode 12, when we talk about the Cathar Crusade, and all the way back in season 1, episode 13, we talk about the Sethians. So check those out if you haven't already. Cool beans. Am I good to do my outros?
Yeah, outro away.
Cool beans. You can find me on the internet at I Appreciate Your Butt at thetwitter.com. That is IAPPRECI. The number 8, URBUTT. I got it right. Hell yeah. Woo!
Yay!
So you can find me on Twitter and TikTok accordingly. And you can also find me at Tumblr at I Appreciate Your Butt, but spelled out correctly. And you can find this podcast as a whole at the Hyperfix Pod on TikTok, Twitter, and Tumblr. So check us out, whichever works best for your social media desires. And then we got brilliant and pre-recorded all the other plugs, so I can stop there. Thank you to the Moonshot Network for making this podcast possible. You can find the Moonshot Network and many other podcasts this network has to offer at Moonshot Pods on Twitter.com. You can also find them on Twitch at Moonshot Network, where they do amazing streams regularly, as well as charity streams like our upcoming Moon Carnival in May. Thank you to Offuscate, that is OFUSKATE, for our intro and outro music. So if you need a podcast intro and outro music of your own, check them out on SoundCloud, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find this podcast as a whole at the Hyperfix Pod at twitter.com, as well as TikTok and Tumblr. This podcast has been edited by our amazing, lovely editor, Kingdom, and you can find them at twitter.com/Tachyon Kingdom. Did you know we have a Patreon? Did you know that you could support your fellow neurospicy co-hosts in their endeavors to learn everything in the world? So they've contacted other neurospicy individuals to info dump on them. You can support them at patreon.com/the Hyperfixation. And for as little as $1 a month, you too can get early access to all these episodes. And you can also get bonus content, extra videos. Like right now, there is an 1.5-hour video about the Exo Sisters out. You didn't even know that, did you? So yeah, go check out our Patreon. that would be awesome. And thank you.
One of the things that a lot of these shows do, when the person reading the credits is reading their own credit, to be like, and I am the person reading these credits, or like, I am the announcer who's been reading these credits. They'll often say, like, if I were saying it, then maybe this is the way we could
Hell yeah.
close off, is both of us doing it, is they would say, "This is Wheels speaking." Which, I don't know, I just think
This
it's
is
cute.
Romy speaking. Good night.
Hell yeah.
Roma Wines present
Suspense.
Roma Wines, made in California for enjoyment throughout the world.
Salud! Your health, senor.
Roma Wines toast the world. The wine for your table is Roma Wine, made in California for enjoyment throughout the world.
Lights. Camera. Adaptations. Ever watched your favorite book become a movie and said, well, that certainly was a weird decision? Of course you have. Hollywood is constantly making changes for their adaptations, and this podcast aims to answer the question of why. Join host Emma Shannon and a different guest every month on Unnatural Selection, a new Moonshot Network podcast, as they talk about a film, its source material, and what makes an adaptation good, faithful, and less commonly, good and faithful. Check out Episode 1, coming to a podcatcher near you on February 15th.